Back to today's video. Today is Saturday, November 2nd, 2024, and today officially marks 3 days out from the 2024 presidential election, and Donald Trump has spent the past week visiting a number of battleground states, but also making detours in states like Virginia and New Mexico, completely changing trajectory of where he's going to be spending these final 7 days, and looking at where he's investing his time and resources speaks to a broader problem we have seen exhibited across the Donald Trump campaign since nearly the very beginning of this presidential election cycle. Now, Donald Trump and the Republican Party back in May and June, especially after the presidential debate, announced that they would be investing time and efforts into states like Virginia and Minnesota and New Hampshire, and opening up field offices and sending volunteers to those states, sending surrogates, making sure that Donald Trump was on track to win some of these states. But back then, and as we know it now, these states were states that the Democratic ticket, no matter who they nominated and when they nominated, the Democratic Party was always going to win these states. The question of how much they won by was a different question that needed to be answered, but ultimately now today, with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, these battleground states that used to be battlegrounds, either I'd say now are no longer battlegrounds, like New Mexico and Virginia, have become out of reach for the Donald Trump campaign in a way that makes it quite surprising that they're spending their time investing in those states. Now, I think ultimately what we find in the 2024 election is that on our map here, we're working with 7 battleground states. We're working with states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. It's very rare that we have states that expand beyond that map, and there's a reason for that. When you're looking at where Donald Trump has tried to spend a lot of his time, it actually made sense. For a considerable portion of this election, he has been on target as to which states he is visiting. We've seen times where they've wavered back and forth, but never this close to an election, which is why I personally find it to be quite surprising. On your screen right now are the campaign visits from Trump and Harris from August 5th through October 25th. August 6th was the day that Kamala Harris announced Tim Walz as her VP, and October 25th was just around last week. And so as you can see, although he made a few stops to New York and California, which we obviously did talk about at the time because it was honestly a waste of time if you're looking at things, and in some cases actually ended up being such a negative impact that Madison Square Garden rally that Donald Trump would have never had his campaign stayed out of New York. And I will say too, some of these campaign stops are for fundraisers. Some of the things that they do aren't actually being done in these states for rallying purposes, but in the case of Donald Trump, unlike Kamala Harris, the majority of them are not fundraisers if they're not in battleground states. For instance, he's made stops, right, in New York. He's made stops in a number of other states. California, Colorado. Colorado's a big one too. I find it to be interesting that we talked about briefly when it was happening here. But the TLDR on this front is that Donald Trump, for the most part, was in fact staying on message, visiting Michigan, visiting Wisconsin, visiting Georgia, visiting North Carolina, visiting Pennsylvania, because these are the states that make all the difference. But it is a genuine point of concern that just so close to the election, Donald Trump is now trying to expand his electoral college map. The New York Times wrote a good piece talking about why Trump was campaigning in New Mexico and Virginia. And the answer here from Caroline Leavitt, who ran for Congress in 2022, is now the National Press Secretary for Donald Trump. Her answer was pretty simple. Donald Trump is playing offensive. He's here to swing some states from blue to red, to flip some states that he lost in both 2020 and 2016, and he believed that this cycle was going to be the one to do it. And when he's making comments like, we're going to win New Mexico, we're going to win Colorado, we're going to win Minnesota, we're going to win Virginia, we're going to win New York, you start to see that those who Donald Trump surrounds himself with don't exactly give him the fullest picture. While Kamala Harris did do a rally in Texas, it wasn't as if Texas is the state that the Kamala Harris campaign has been thoroughly convinced, or even on the national level, ever said that they were going to win that state. It was a rallying call and brought in tens of thousands of supporters, and was a big deal for the media blitz that followed it, with Beyonce's endorsement and many other members of the press that saw that rally as a turning point in the Democratic Party. All of a sudden, articles are popping up. Why is Kamala Harris in Texas? Is this a new state in play? Is she making a specific appeal to different demographic groups in Texas? Is Beyonce's endorsement going to sway voters across the country? A bunch of different things popped up from it, and it honestly was quite masterful. But when Donald Trump does these things, unlike the vice president, you find that most of them end in disaster. Again, remember that Madison Square Garden rally that just simply wouldn't have happened unless he decided to visit New York and invite in those types of speakers. Traditionally speaking, Although I'm sure there are many headlines that have come from direct Trump rallies in the battleground states, it's a lot easier to contain that when you're not expanding outside of your comfort zone, expanding beyond swing states, because for the most part, you have state party teams that vet and recruit all the speakers in your state. Voters in Pennsylvania probably don't want to hear the same things that a voter in Arizona does. And the regional and the localized, micro-targeting does make a difference in campaigns. But in New York, they try to do a star-studded event, combat Kamala Harris's celebrity level of endorsements that she has seen from so many different celebrities, actors, actresses, musicians all across the nation. He tried to replicate that, and instead, it wasn't just a wash. This was a negative impact on the Donald Trump campaign in a way that we will likely only see on Election Day in terms of direct repercussions. But again, back to that point about New Mexico and Virginia, let's ground ourselves in reality too, because the Donald Trump team, again, has been very adamant that they believe they have a genuine shot at winning some of these states. And for context, the last time Republicans did well in Virginia was in 2021 with Glenn Youngkin, who notably ran far away from the former president, refused to even do a rally with him in the state of Virginia. And then you also take a look at New Mexico. The last time Republicans have done well there was arguably 2014, when they were able to win statewide. And since then, Democrats have had a really good show in terms of support in off years, midterm years, special elections, and presidential election years. And the 2020 election was no different. In both New Mexico and Virginia, Biden won by double digits. And even grounding ourselves back further into where we are, we can take a look at things like the 538 forecast, which give a genuine depiction of our current state of the race, a true and total toss-up, but Virginia isn't. Kamala Harris wins Virginia in 92% of forecasts here. Donald Trump gets just 8% in terms of a likelihood at winning in Virginia. And in terms of margin of victory, Kamala Harris is projected to defeat Donald Trump in Virginia by roughly 7 points. Now, it's not massive, and it's not this slam dunk in Virginia, especially not like Biden's in 2020, but it does go to show that there hasn't been any improvement, really, for Donald Trump over time. I mean, we've seen that the margins here might have slightly narrowed up. September 18th was the best day on the 538 forecast for Kamala Harris to date, and that gave her less than 0.1% less than what Biden got in the last election. And so honestly speaking, it really hasn't narrowed in a way that is tremendous, nothing super notable, and at the end of the day, Virginia is blue through and through. And New Mexico is no different. When it comes down to the margin and chance of victory here, Kamala Harris is up by the same amount against the former president, 92 to 8%. And you can see here that in terms of popular vote, very similar story. This is actually bordering the lens of 8 points in terms of the margin of victory. Again, September 18th, the best day on record for Kamala Harris in the 538 forecast, shows her underperforming. Yes, underperforming what the numbers would have been had this been Biden's 2020 election, given what we were seeing nationally. She was winning North Carolina in this forecast, Georgia and Arizona. It would have been a larger electoral college victory, and even then, it's an outperformance of Biden's 2020 result by just 0.3%. And I know I'm not here to try to downplay or upplay the 2020 election and Kamala Harris's performance, but based on where we are right now, the shift here is minimal at most, and it's a state that no party should be investing in because we know how it's going to go. And in terms of win probability, it really hasn't changed too much. Even on that best day for Kamala Harris, the numbers are better today for Kamala Harris in terms of percent chance of victory than they were then. Even though the margin was expected to be higher, the chance at winning has increased from where it was at the start at 79%. Donald Trump had a 1 in 5% chance, 1 in 5 chance of winning the state. Today, it's less than 1 in 10. And so now we have to go back. Who is it that is advising Donald Trump in the final stages of this campaign period, where it is clear that everything needs to be done correctly? What we have noticed over the past 4 days, in these final 7 days, is that 4 out of the 7 days, the media focus has been negative on Donald Trump. Let's talk about some positive moments to really ground ourselves for the former president. Really positive moment for Donald Trump's candidacy, the day of the assassination attempt. All the news articles were talking about how Donald Trump was going to change and pivot to a unifying tone, that this assassination attempt really shook him and changed the way he perceived unifying the nation, changed the way he perceived approaching this election. And a lot of positive press coming back from the fact that just overnight, he was able to get back on the campaign trail, that this was a really good defining moment for the election because it showed that amidst all the division, that one presidential candidate was able to stand up and continue going in the face of all adversity, including an attempt on his life. Then came in the RNC. A lot of positive press always comes in with the Republican convention, and let's not even talk about, because we don't need to spend too much time on it, but the entire month of July, from that presidential debate for CNN, we saw no negative articles on Donald Trump. Why? Because they were all circled around President Biden. But let's take a look at when Kamala Harris came into the race. Since then, we haven't seen much positive news for Donald Trump. Tim Walz's pick was largely appreciated by the American public. We saw they generally approved of that decision, no major dissenters. We saw the DNC happened. A lot of reworking Kamala Harris's vision. She bumped up to a positive in terms of national approval for the first time since 2021, and it looked like Democrats were on track for victory. Then came the September presidential debate, the only presidential debate, and Kamala Harris decisively won it. And so for a while, we've seen that a lot of the coverage here has been in favor of Kamala Harris because she's been on record. She's been on message. No major deviations at rallies. No mishaps that have been elevated to the national stage in the same way that we've seen people like Donald Trump, who have now started to receive receive anxiety in the internal team, including Donald Trump himself, as he starts to realize that what won him the election in 2016 was a final surge of momentum in his advantage. The James Comey letter dropped. We saw the investigation was going to reopen. Early voting was underway, and it completely changed any discussion around the Access Hollywood tape that previously had doomed Donald Trump's bid. This time, we're not seeing something similar happen. The Donald Trump team largely has not been on message. Again, these rallies and these comments being made specifically about Puerto Rican Americans, you are going to find that there are a lot of voters who are of Puerto Rican descent in battleground states. You find that citizens in Pennsylvania, nearly 500,000 are of Puerto Rican descent when there were 7 million votes cast in the last election. The University of Central Florida came out with a poll in Florida that showed that amongst voters in Florida who are Puerto Rican, that 85% of them back Kamala Harris and just 8% back the former president. For context, in 2020, those numbers looked like 69-31 in favor of Biden. And so a massive improvement off of that. And while I'm not here to say that that's going to be the definitive 100% certainty for the remainder of the election, everything that has come over the past week has been about Donald Trump's campaign team not being on top of things. The more that he does things, last night we saw that there was some very interesting clips that surfaced from the Trump rally. All of it comes up to be negative. Donald Trump's comments in Arizona, whether in context or not, look bad to the eyes of a swing voter. Talking about Liz Cheney, regardless of how you cut it, regardless of who you approve of or support, the way that it was said and the way that it was phrased are words that should never be uttered by a presidential candidate who is looking to win over swing voters that are looking for a different style of campaigning. Because it is this style of campaigning that lost him in 2020, but the style of campaigning we actually saw shift away in 2016. I encourage you to watch some of Donald Trump's rallies from the final days of the 2016 election, and you will find that they actually feel very different than they do today. And that's because Donald Trump did something right in 16. Coupled with the momentum, it was the perfect storm by he staying on message and on task and on brand, unlike what he's doing today. These Virginia and New Mexico rallies really throw me for a loop because it shows there's some people close to him who have been telling him misleading information about where he can win and how he can win. Because the Kamala Harris campaign, you will find, will very rarely step out of the 7 battleground states. Maryland, there's a Senate race there. Illinois, you saw that was the DNC, and of course, you had to make a campaign stop there. New York were no rallies, but there were stops there for Democratic candidates and fundraising swings. But the rest, California fundraising as well, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Colorado, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all of these were campaign rallies. Never really off track here. Donald Trump, though, in Montana, Senate race, I'll give him that, right? Virginia, though, makes no sense. No competitive Senate race, no competitive governor's race, nothing really of substance there besides the fact that Donald Trump's team believes they can win Virginia. Newsflash, they can't. Moving over to Colorado. Now add New Mexico to that list. Again, you sort of go around. New York had multiple rallies in the Bronx, at Madison Square Garden. You're seeing that Donald Trump's campaign team seems to believe that when he goes to some of these other states, the media from it is more positive than negative. Well, that Madison Square Garden rally should be an absolutely example, a clear example of why it's not always positive to even go to areas that might not make a difference electorally. And that you should keep things localized, keep things in the battleground states. But it speaks to a broader problem. And that broader problem has been discussed time and time again on this channel. And I really do think that Donald Trump has surrounded himself this cycle, unlike 16 and arguably even unlike 20, by a bunch of yes men who refuse to tell him that he's even in a competitive position. You can see that this Axios article talks about how for the past 3 months, with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, Donald Trump has genuinely believed there's no chance he loses the election to her. That there's no circumstance and no reality that any of these states that he lost in 2020 stay in the Democratic column. But that's not where we are. There are real data points and real signs pointing to a Kamala Harris victory. And if Donald Trump and his campaign team can't see that, they're willfully ignoring what we are seeing from the majority of the American public. That Kamala Harris is, in fact, a very viable candidate and might be the next president of the United States. And now this grounding in reality and realizing that maybe some of these rallies that were in Virginia could have been better spent in Pennsylvania. The tens of thousands of dollars, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that it takes to do things like the Madison Square Garden rally that ended up being an overall net negative for the Trump campaign would have been better purposed in opening up more field offices in Arizona, bussing down volunteers from South Carolina to Georgia. It is all about ground game. It is all about get out the vote efforts. And Donald Trump's campaign team doesn't seem to understand that. And a lot of it could just be in only surrounding himself by yes men on the campaign, that it's also happening to the broader Republican Party. After all, Laura Trump is the co-chair of the RNC. I guarantee you the people that she hired, Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, all of them together have come to this understanding incorrectly, that Donald Trump is guaranteed to be the next president of the United States. That's why you have Heritage working on things like Project 2025. That's why you have all these organizations really not focusing on get out the vote efforts, because what they believe they are seeing today is that Donald Trump wins in a landslide. But that's not our reality. That's not the American reality. And although Donald Trump may win the election, it will certainly not be for his advisors, but for fundamental data points that show that no Democrat, in theory, should ever be able to win an election like this one, given the national top lines. But Kamala Harris has made it work, and Donald Trump has done everything to work in her favor, including stupid campaign rallies like those in New Mexico and Virginia. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.